Now, Zoro's Enma has been a very huge topic in the community ever since its reveal in chapter 955, and it was also a special reveal because this is one of the few swords in the series, or actually the only sword in the series to have a special trait or ability. The only other sword that even comes close to it, and that's kind of a stretch, is Shisui, which is a black blade. And if you guys remember during Trailer Bark, Zoro mentions that the unique trait of a black blade is that they are known for their hardness and durability, and as well as it having the ability to enhance strike and force, which is one of the main reasons Zoro uses Shisui when he uses one sword style. And so when you come to Enma, it's definitely one of a kind, and given the introduction and the hype it's gotten so far, I think it's very fair to say that more than likely it might have a role into hurting Kaido later in this arc. Now, I don't think Zoro is going to kill Kaido per se, just more so that he might help Luffy, Kid, and Law, and whoever is fighting Kaido in terms of how they deal damage to Kaido. And so today I want to talk more in depth about Enma because I think there's more to it than what was said, especially when it comes to its abilities and how that might come into play against Kaido, and also how it progresses Zoro's strength as a swordsman. And there's also hints that we can get from other swords that could explain Enma's ability and how it was shown against Kaido 20 years ago, because I think a lot of things were left out purposely because Oda wants to show the actual reveal during the actual war, right? But we'll get more into that in this video. But again, if you're new here, subscribe, and I would appreciate it if you liked the video. Now, in chapter 955, Zoro was given Enma, which was a replacement for Shisui, which he had to give back to Wano. And Enma again is a one-of-a-kind sword because it has a special ability, and basically what it does is that it forces the user to use an absorbed amount of Ryo in its attacks. We saw that Zoro tried to use Enma to cut a tree, the effect kicked in, and the entire coast was cut. And without some degree of mastering an ornament, it's enough to drain your haki completely, as we saw with Zoro's hands afterwards. And what's very interesting here is that it's not exactly a power-up in a sense that it gives the user a boost in strength right away. One has to master the sword before they can actually use it in a proper way. And it's also an ability that uses the user's strength. In this case, it forces the user to release more haki. So there isn't any outside factor, whereas it directly makes you stronger. It's more of a gradual change, but the fact is that it does make you stronger when you master it, as stated by Zoro. And regardless of it being a power-up or not, this is an ability that not only makes Zoro stronger in terms of ornament haki control in the long run, but it's also an ability that makes the user surpass their limits, again given the definition of its ability. For example, let's say that Zoro tries to do his best attacks that requires all of his haki to be used. Enma would force him to use 150%, an amount that he wouldn't be able to draw by himself. It would basically make him go beyond his limit, and obviously at the cost of something. But again, pushing himself to the limit, it only leaves more room for growth. And this is also something that applies to Rayleigh's definition of haki. The more extreme the battle is, the more the fighter grows. And Enma is a good weapon that can push Zoro to those very limits. I sort of see it in the same light as Gear 4th, whereas Luffy uses a lot of haki in that form. If Zoro used Ashura with Enma, I think it would be a lot different than normal. Now, the other advantage, as I mentioned earlier, would be giving the user more control over the use of haki, ornament haki specifically. And so if Zoro has to regulate the amount of haki he uses over a period of time, this would allow him to have a more refined control over Ryo. His attacks would become more fine-tuned and precise, and probably more concentrated. And one of the things that I've noticed about Zoro is that his swordsmanship seems to be focused around the idea of brute force. Zoro exerts a lot of power into his skill sets, and even Mihawk mentioned this pre-time skip when he first fought Zoro at Baratie, and he basically states that Zoro's fighting style is ferocious. It seems to be very rough on the edges. Now obviously this was pre-time skip, and Zoro has grown a lot stronger ever since then as a swordsman, but I still think he has that ferociousness in the way he fights, and this also applies to his swordsmanship. And so Enma might be able to bridge that gap, whereas it doesn't only train his haki, but also in the way he fights with the sword, a more refined and skillful way of fighting. Zoro throughout the New World has been very linear in terms of how he fights. from what it looks like, his attacks are mostly focused on destructive force, again, which goes back to Mihawk's statement about Zoro having a very ferocious swordsmanship style. And Zoro makes this very apparent because during Punk Hazard, Zoro was really interested in Kinemon's swordsmanship that's able to cut fire, and it looks like he wanted to learn it, which was the reason he chose to help Kinemon find Momonosuke in the first place. So Zoro is aware of these sword techniques that require more than just brute force. And if you look at any other swordsman like Vista, he has a sword ability that makes his attacks replicate the effects of flower petals. It feels like Zoro is lacking in the technical aspect of swordsmanship, and of course training his armament could help him with that. And that seems to be a thing in Wano, whereas raw power isn't enough. We saw that Luffy, even with Gear 4th, couldn't do anything against Kaido, but now that he's mastered this new form of armament that seems to be focused around the idea of flow, a concept that is more technical than anything, this seems to be the thing that bridges that gap and gives him what is necessary for him to hurt Kaido. I think Zoro will most likely go through a similar thing. Again, the Straw Hats are going up against multiple commanders and possibly 2 Yonkos, including Big Mom, right? There's a lot of room for growth for Zoro, and this would allow Zoro to imbue his sword with, the advanced armament haki. The same thing Roger and Whitebeard did in the flashback. Obviously not on the same scale, but at least for him to achieve that mastery. Now, going back to Enma here. Now, one of the information that I really found interesting was that Hitetsu mentioned that Wado Ichimonji and Enma were made by the same person. And because of that, Zoro is able to control Enma at a faster rate. Now, I feel like this can lead into something much more. For example, them being used in conjunction in battle can bring out the sword's true potential. And this brings me back to a plot point that hasn't been talked about yet or hasn't gotten any follow-up yet. And that plot point is Zoro saying that he wants a fire sword. Now, we don't know what a fire sword entails, but we can assume that it is a sword that somehow replicates fire to some degree, perhaps in the same fashion that Vista replicates flower petals. And so initially when I heard about Enma during, the first reveal, I thought it was a fire sword for 3 reasons. The first reason was its name. Enma in Japanese mythology stands for the King of Hell. And since hell is a fiery place, I thought it could have some sort of burning or fire properties. And if you look at Enma's design, it does have this flame pattern in the middle, which is a design we haven't seen from any other sword in the series, so maybe there's something there. Now, the second reason was that Kaido's scar seems to be very reminiscent of Luffy's scar. They actually look the same if you, place them side by side. So at some point, I actually thought that Akainu and Kaido fought, and Akainu gave him that scar, especially after learning that Akainu's Devil Fruit has the highest attack potential out of any known Devil Fruit. And so knowing that Akainu gave Luffy that scar and that Kaido has a similar one, I assumed that it was a heat related ability that gave Kaido that scar. And so when we learned about Odin's sword Enma giving that Kaido that scar, I thought Enma had like this flame like effect. And the third and most important reason was, again, that Zoro said he wanted a fire sword. And so I thought there was a good chance that it could be a fire sword, that Enma could be a fire sword, but from what we know so far, that hasn't been said. But again, going back to my original point about Wado Ichimonji and Enma having some sort of special trait if used together, and given that it was made by the same person, I could see that being a thing, whereas Zoro unlocks a new ability because he's using both swords in conjunction. I feel like Hitetsu's statement about Zoro learning Enma faster because of Wado Ichimonji could lead into something much more, and some sort of power up later in this arc. Now, granted, people did have issues with how Kaido and Odin went down, especially as there wasn't any exposition as to why Enma is the only blade to hurt Kaido, even though the Ame no Habakiri did the same thing. But I think Oda is honestly waiting for the war to happen before he gives more detail as to why it was able to penetrate Kaido's invincible body. I think certain things in this flashback wasn't mentioned because Oda is saving its reveal for the war at Onigashima. Now, food for thought, Lando on Twitter brings up a very good point about Enma, whereas it could also have the same effect as Shisui, whereas the flying sword attack merges into one attack, or maybe Enma has the ability to force Ryuo in the user in a general sense, and not just the hand that the sword is in. So maybe if you have 2 swords, Ryuo is forced in both swords, and that would make sense because Enma is still mentioned to be the only sword to scar Kaido, even in the Viz manga translation. So it's not a typo. So I feel like there has to be some sort of explanation. Or there's also a chance that Oda forgot, so who knows. Again, this will most likely happen during the the war or when Zoro gets his matchup against King or whoever. But I'm definitely looking forward to this. But again, what do you guys think about Enma, and what role do you guys see Zoro playing versus Kaido? Comment down below what you guys think. Like the video if you liked it, and subscribe for more One Piece content. It is Pharaoh, and I will see you folks later. Peace.